The Airbnb market is in crisis. Hosts are crashing out, losing thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And a lot of hosts are basically leaving the business completely. Here's what's happening, and here's what you can also do to pivot so that you are not stuck and so you can still make money in this economy, especially in this time in 2025 and beyond. So there are a lot of hosts just exiting out of Airbnb completely. And two big ones that I want to talk about are Robuilt, who is a huge Airbnb creator here on YouTube. I love that he has shared his journey over the last couple of years on how he has grown his Airbnb portfolio. And another is Sean Rakajit, hope I pronounced that right, of Airbnb Automated. So Robuilt talks about how he is now selling over 45 of his Airbnb listings completely. He's just exiting out of the market and he's only holding on to one or two or a handful of them. I used to host over 20 Airbnbs doing over $250,000 in bookings revenue. And I actually got out of Airbnb about 3 years ago now for a number of reasons, some being really personal. And if you know my story, you know what happened. But other reasons include that I could kind of see the writings on the wall and I was starting to grow just for the sake of growing. And there was a lot of operational overhead with Airbnb that I just didn't want to deal with anymore. And one of the biggest takeaways is that Airbnb is not a passive strategy. We'll talk more about that later on in this video. So with Robuilt, he found that he was just burnt out from scaling way too fast and too wide. He had too many units. And with Airbnb, that's a lot of things that you have to manage. There are so many moving pieces with this business strategy. You have to make sure your properties are being well maintained. You have to manage your cleaners and make sure they're doing their cleaning turnover correctly. You even have to manage with Airbnb, and when you have to put in claims, following up with those claims, making sure that you're getting paid out from damages that guests have actually done, filing those claims. It's a whole deal. And he talks about how operational stress just became unsustainable. And I felt the same way. Like I had Airbnb business for freedom. And initially that's what it was giving me when I was at 1 to 2, even 5 properties. But when I began to scale and I had 20 units, I just had to now manage my team that was managing my units, make sure my team was doing what they're supposed to do. And it just became a lot. Also talks about how door count does not equal joy or efficiency. And again, a lot of us become entrepreneurs because we're trying, even chasing, more freedom, more flexibility, more joy. And door count in the Airbnb space, it's only almost become door disease, right? You think you just have to grow for the sake of growing, and growing for the sake of growing is just asinine sometimes. I mean, this is, to me, a lot of the problem with startups that I've worked with. They are just growing and growing and growing, not for any particular reason other than the sake of growth and wanting to make more money. But sometimes when you are growing at scale, you're making less profit, if that makes sense. You're making less profit, but you have more units. So yes, it looks like you're making more money overall, but you're making less profit on each unit. So now you just have a glut and bloat of properties or units making way less than if you had, maybe just a handful making more per unit. And bringing it back to joy, a lot of times when you grow at a certain scale, if you got into Airbnb because you enjoyed the design and putting together a really cute, unique property someone could go and stay at and enjoy, you really can't do that to the same degree when you are at scale, when you're hosting 20 units, 45 units, 100 units. You just can't. And so taking it back down to the basics really can bring that joy back to your business. And then he touches on what we said earlier, that Airbnb is really not a 100% passive business strategy. Now, nothing really is 100% passive income, but when you are especially at scale with Airbnb, it is not passive. You have to manage maintenance, especially. You have to manage your cleaners. And when you don't, you start to get poor quality units. And that's when you start to get bad guest reviews. So your listings are not performing as well. It's giving Airbnb as a business overall a bad name. And that's why you see all of the news articles and stories of people going to an Airbnb and it was just a shit show because most likely that host may have scaled too quickly, so they can't maintain the properties. They haven't gone in and even looked at the property to see, oh, this piece of furniture that I put in and was gorgeous when I first got it is now worn down because I've had, 30 guests in the last year or so. So I think that hosts have to consider as well. And then he talks about quality over quantity. And this is huge. And if I were to ever get back into the Airbnb game, this is what I would do as well. You want to have uniqueness and the beauty of a property in one or two, a handful of properties, instead of having a whole lot of vanilla cookie cutter, the basics luxury studio apartment vibe, right? You really want to have something that is speaking to a guest and is giving them something better than they can find in a hotel, because the hotel industry has come back with a vengeance. There was a period where people were opting for Airbnbs over hotels, but that period is ended. And so if you're not giving someone something better than they can get in a hotel that's going to give them a standard quality, then you're not going to win. Hotels have been doing this hospitality game for hundreds of years, and these are huge corporations versus your mom and pop Airbnb host, or even the corporate Airbnb host who's only been doing it for a handful of years, versus a hotel that they've got their structures and their systems down to a science. So if you want to compete, it's going to be on the quality, that beautiful, luscious, unique, experience-rich property that is going to make someone want to book your property over a regular hotel. Now, Sean of Airbnb Automated talks about how he lost over $500,000 from his Airbnb business. Yes, million. And I respect him so much because he has shared his journey, the ins and outs, the nitty gritties here on YouTube for years. And so he talks about some of the huge lessons that he's learned and some of his biggest takeaways. So first he talks about how ego, hubris, and overexpansion led to disaster for him. And a lot of hosts found this, especially during the heyday of COVID. You could throw up an Airbnb property and it could look pretty basic and you were going to get booked because post-pandemic, everybody and their mama was traveling. This is when I was making the most money as well. And it was just a great time to be a host. But you still had to do things strategically and the smart way. And a lot of hosts, Sean included, expanded into areas that maybe weren't the best fit for Airbnb. He talks about Philadelphia, and that city had really strong regulations even back then, and now has even stronger short-term regulations where it's really hard, if not impossible, to operate. And many hosts who do rental arbitrage, which is when you go out and you rent a property directly from a landlord and you turn around and you list that property on Airbnb with permission, hopefully. A lot of people don't, which is, that's a whole nother story, whole nother video. But with rental arbitrage, you're not getting any appreciation. You're just getting cash flow, which is great when things are good. But when things are not so good, you're going to lose all those properties, which means you're going to lose all of the money that you put into designing those properties, setting up systems, and all the things. And so this is where you really want to do your research about where you are investing and the strategy you use, even if you are continuing to do Airbnb. His next lesson was how oversupply and lack of differentiation kills profit. And we talked about this a little bit before. Those bland cookie cutter units are not going to cut it anymore, especially in competitive markets. Sean talks about how he made the mistake of taking on a 40-unit apartment building and designing them pretty much almost exactly the same, and how a lot of them sat pretty empty most of the time. Most of them were vacant and not booked, and only like 4 or 5 would be booked at a time. Can you imagine having 40 units that you are paying rent on that just aren't getting booked and are not making money? And I'll talk about this a little later, but this is what happened to a lot of these corporate Airbnb hosts like Stay Alfred and Zeus that had these huge, entire buildings that they rented from and made them all look the same, pretty cute, but pretty much basic and all the same. And then they sat vacant and they lost a lot of money when the market shifted. I even worked for Zeus for a little while, for a couple of months when I was first getting started with Airbnb, because I wanted to learn how to grow at scale. And that was when I realized initially that, growing just for the sake of growing is kind of silly. Like, I was one of their field designers. So I would actually go and put together a unit from scratch. So all of the furniture, all of the artwork, all of that, I would help put it together and put it all up. And it got to the point towards the end when I was working with them where I was putting up 3-4 units in a day. These were studios, so it didn't take that much time because everything was laid out, everything was planned. But I was just like, okay, 3 units a day. And I'm not the only one doing this. Like, how many properties do you need? How many units do you need? And the good citizen part of me was like, okay, now all these units are Airbnbs, even though they were doing midterm rentals, so 30 days or more. But that's taking away from the regular housing stock, which is, a big issue that a lot of people have with short-term rentals and Airbnbs to begin with. So even as a host, I was like, is this the best thing that we should be doing? Because like now this whole building is just people who are in and out, kind of transient, and they're not really people who need long-term housing, if that makes sense. So that was a big takeaway for me as well. Going back to the growing for the sake of growing is just not smart. The next lesson is how cash is king and how running out of cash in any real estate business, really in any business period, can really end you. So a lot of hosts get emotionally attached to their properties, and even when they're underperforming, they hold on to them, and they will either say, oh, next month will be better, or they'll just start using cash that is making money at other units to cover the expenses of this underperforming unit. And that's something Sean did as well. And he held on to these bad properties for way longer than he needed to. And this was a lesson I learned as well. I had a bunch of units in Washington, D.C. that were doing great, but even post-pandemic, when I had some units that were doing gangbusters, I had others that they just always had some issue. I did a lot of co-hosting, so they may have a lot of issues because the landlord wasn't willing to make these repairs in a timely fashion. So even though I thought that they were fixed, guests would come and it's just not working out. I let go of those properties after a handful of times where something like that would happen, instead of trying to make it work and just, one, ruining my own reputation as an Airbnb host, and two, just losing money in general. So the lesson there is it's way better to walk away from something that's not performing than trying to get blood out of a stone and keep hitting your head up against a wall trying to make it work. And if you're interested in maybe taking on a different type of strategy that is more sustainable, a lot more passive and laid back, go ahead and check out my free Section 8 investing mini course in the description box below, where I teach you exactly how to get started with Section 8 rentals, how to get guaranteed rent in the next 30 to 90 days, and how to do it without having to deal with bad tenants or overwhelm and government headaches. So now let's talk about how the short-term rental market in general is kind of in crisis mode. Here are some statistics. So overall, nationally, occupancy rates have dropped drastically. So this is how many units are actually booked at any given time. And they're currently at 46% occupied, down from 67% occupied just a year ago. And in formerly hot markets like Phoenix, Nashville, and Miami, they are below 40%. Yes, occupancy rates in those cities are below 40%. And the reason this matters is that oversupply and the reduced travel demands means that the hosts that are still in the market are competing for less guests to actually book their properties, which means less profit for your unit. The second thing affecting the Airbnb market is that costs are way up. So this includes insurance costs to cover your property, which are up 34% nationally and even higher in certain markets, with some investors reporting a 150% increase in their insurance rates. Cleaning, maintenance, and management prices have all spiked as well. And on top of that, over 342 cities and markets across the country have passed some sort of short-term rental restriction. Now, when I was in the Airbnb game, this had just started, so it wasn't as bad as it is now. But now, these regulations include all-out short-term rental Airbnb bans, additional taxes to be able to host an Airbnb short-term rental, and general limitations on who can host, how many units can be in a city at any given time, and so many other restrictions as well. The third thing that makes this an Airbnb crisis mode that we haven't even seen the full effect of yet is that bad financing strategies and upcoming rate hikes could make for a huge financial time bomb. So many Airbnbs were bought between 2020 and 2022 when the interest rates were super low, anywhere from like 1 to 2.65% low. Wish we had those again. But a lot of them were purchased using cash out refis and adjustable rate loans that are now coming due. The problem is these people had these rates at 2% interest, maybe 3% or even 4%, and now interest rates have doubled. So your property that was able to make a profit when you had a 3% interest loan is now going to have to deal with a 6, 7, 8% interest loan. So the profit that you were making is going to be reduced significantly, if not in the negative. And the statistics show that at the number of people who have these type of loans, around 73% of short-term rentals bought during that time frame would now operate at a loss, meaning they would not cash flow at all or even break even if they had to refinance today at these rates. So we could see a lot of Airbnb hosts, and we have started to already, start to sell off their properties and flood the market. Now, this could mean a couple of things where there is going to be a glut of housing, but in this country, we need a lot more properties on the market. And for savvy investors, they can pick up these properties at discounts, either investors or even home buyers, and get these houses for way less than they could have, just a year ago, and start to make a profit with their properties. Just like a lot of investors did in the post-2008 housing crisis, those that were able to pick up properties then really made a killing, and you can do the same thing now. The best strategy right now for those of you interested in picking up some of those properties once they start to sell off is to focus on cash flow and not speculation. And one of the best ways to do this, in my opinion, is with Section 8 rentals. So again, if you are interested in learning how to do Section 8 successfully so you avoid the horror stories we've all heard about, go ahead and check out my free Section 8 investing mini course in the description box below. So this Airbnb crash out or crisis could be the market correction we've all been hearing about and even praying for in the last couple of years. So let me know in the comments what you think, if you think that we could be seeing a correction, especially with all the changes in the market happening and with the tariffs and the economy changes, or if you think it's going to be kind of the same status quo we've been seeing the last couple of years. And now that you've watched this video, go ahead and check out this next one here so you can pair the two together and be even further along on your passive income and real estate journey.